Behind Ford's empire of steel and innovation lay a secret web of loans, inflation, and sacrifice where the ordinary paid the price for extraordinary ambition and the truth buried within those marble walls. So what really happened inside Ford's mansion when the empire began to crumble? We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. There are empires that rise not from gold, but from promises. Henry Ford's empire was one of them. Behind every gleaming automobile and every polished tile of his mansion lay a labyrinth of hidden financial struggles, debts, and desperate maneuvers to keep a dream from collapsing under its own weight. To the world, Ford was a man who had mastered industry, who turned iron and oil into motion, who made the automobile a symbol of freedom. But deep within the machinery of his empire, money whispered its own truth, a truth of scarcity, of loans quietly taken, of inflation gnawing at the edges of ambition. Ford's story, often told as a triumph of ingenuity and willpower, was also a story of constant financial pressure, of fighting against a tide that even his genius could not fully control. In the early years of his success, Ford sought not merely to build cars, but to build a new kind of society, one where the working man could afford the very product he created. It was a radical idea, intoxicating in its simplicity. To make it real, Ford doubled wages, slashed prices, and built factories that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of modern life. The world called it progress, but progress has a price, and the currency was debt. Each expansion, each new facility, each modern convenience demanded funding on a scale few could imagine. The cost of innovation was not measured in dollars alone, but in sleepless nights, spent calculating margins that grew thinner as inflation crept higher. The 1910s and 1920s brought both prosperity and peril. The Great War had flooded markets with demand, but when peace returned, the appetite for machinery changed. Nations struggled to pay their debts. The United States, though victorious, was burdened by foreign loans and a fragile economy that swayed under the weight of post-war inflation. Ford, determined to stay independent from bankers and financiers, rejected the easy path of borrowing from Wall Street. He distrusted the men in suits who dealt in paper promises. Instead, he chose to finance growth through his own profits, pushing his factories to produce more, faster, cheaper. The dream of a self-sustaining empire seemed noble, but the margins grew perilously thin. When costs rose and markets faltered, the empire began to feed upon itself. The Ford mansion, often seen as a symbol of prosperity, was also a fortress against financial anxiety. Inside its ornate halls, meetings were held that spoke not of luxury but of survival. The ledgers told stories no headline ever captured, a balance of ambition against solvency, of ideals against arithmetic. As inflation surged, raw materials became more expensive, transportation costs climbed, and wages, though generous, became harder to sustain. Every car sold carried not just profit but the hidden weight of these mounting pressures. Each success demanded another, and soon success itself became a debt. The illusion of endless growth masked the reality of economic fragility. Ford's refusal to rely on banks, though grounded in principle, left him exposed. He had built a world where every financial risk rested squarely on his shoulders. When markets contracted, there was no cushion, no safety net woven by financiers. The same independence that made him a hero of the working man also made him vulnerable to the forces he despised. Inflation, that invisible predator, eroded purchasing power and forced prices upward. The machinery of empire demanded constant feeding. More steel, more fuel, more labor, and each demand drew deeper from reserves that were no longer enough. Meanwhile, the broader economy tightened. Europe, crippled by war debts, could not buy as it once did. The American dollar, once strong, became heavy with the burden of expectation. Foreign loans had been issued to prop up allies, but repayment lagged, and the flow of global trade slowed. Ford's empire, like the nation itself, began to feel the constriction. Factories that once roared with optimism now echoed with uncertainty. The workers sensed it, the subtle slowing of production lines, the careful counting of hours, the quiet tightening of belts. Though Ford still preached abundance, scarcity lingered in every corner of his enterprise. The need for funding became a shadow that followed every decision. The mansion, with its manicured lawns and stone facade, stood as both symbol and shield. Behind its windows, Ford's advisors debated how to maintain the illusion of stability while the accounts told another story. Suppliers demanded payment. Banks watched with cautious eyes. Ford, proud and defiant, refused to yield control. He believed in a purity of business that rejected the manipulations of financiers. But purity can be costly, and stubbornness has its price. As inflation continued to rise, the empire's liquidity shrank. Assets existed on paper, but cash, the lifeblood of any industry, was scarce. It was during this period that desperation quietly entered the story. To sustain production and pay wages, Ford's company resorted to complex maneuvers, delayed payment, renegotiated contracts, and sometimes the silent hope that tomorrow's sales would cover today's debts. In public, Ford remained the picture of confidence, but in private, the tension was unmistakable. The empire that once seemed unshakable had become a delicate balance of pride and arithmetic. Each new model rolled off the line as both triumph and risk, a wager against economic gravity. When the Great Depression began to stir, Ford's financial troubles deepened. Consumer demand plummeted, credit froze, and what had once been manageable debt became a suffocating burden. The same inflation that had once driven prices upward gave way to deflation, turning assets into anchors. The factory lights dimmed, and the flow of money that once seemed endless slowed to a trickle. Workers were laid off by the thousands. Families that had once found hope in Ford's vision now found themselves adrift in despair. The financial strain that had long been hidden beneath the mansion's grandeur was finally exposed. Even then, Ford clung to his ideals. He sold assets, cut costs, and used his personal fortune to keep his factories alive. But money alone could not repair what years of economic strain had eroded. His refusal to engage with the financial institutions he mistrusted left him isolated, battling forces larger than any man could command. Debt was no longer a line on a ledger. It had become a living presence, haunting every decision, every sleepless night, every silent dinner in mansion that had once symbolized victory. The empire that had begun as a dream of independence found itself ensnared in the very web it sought to avoid. Inflation had drained its strength, loans had grown unavoidable, and the desperate need for funding had revealed the fragility of even the most brilliant vision. Ford had built a world where men could move faster than ever before, but the one thing he could not escape was the slow, relentless pull of financial reality. The same ambition that had lifted him to greatness demanded a price paid in anxiety, sacrifice, and silence. And within the cold walls of his mansion, the echoes of those financial struggles lingered like the hum of a distant engine, constant, restless, unending. The moral contradiction between industrial progress and human cost lies at the very heart of Henry Ford's story, like two great engines pulling in opposite directions. On one side, there was vision, the belief that machines could liberate mankind from toil, that technology could give birth to equality, and that progress was the destiny of a new America. On the other, there was the weight of humanity, the aching hands of the worker, the fatigue that settled into their bones, the quiet despair of life consumed by the very machines meant to set them free. Ford's dream was radiant, but the light of progress has always cast a shadow, and in that shadow lived the people whose sweat built his empire, whose lives became the raw material of history's most dazzling illusion. When Ford introduced the assembly line, he changed not just manufacturing but the rhythm of modern life. It was efficiency perfected, a choreography of labor where every second counted, every gesture measured. Cars rolled from the line like miracles of motion, each one cheaper, faster, more accessible than the last. The working man could finally afford what he built. And for a brief moment, it seemed that Ford had conquered the old order of wealth and class. But as the machines quickened, so too did the demands upon those who served them. What was hailed as liberation soon became repetition, monotony, exhaustion. The worker was no longer an artisan but a cog, performing the same motion thousands of times a day, bound to the relentless pace of the conveyor. The moral paradox deepened with every success. Ford doubled wages, an act that stunned the world and earned him the title of a benevolent capitalist. $5 a day. It sounded like justice. It sounded like dignity. But it came with rules, with inspections, with a moral code that reached into private lives. Ford's sociological department patrolled the homes of his workers, judging their cleanliness, their habits, their family structure. Progress demanded discipline, and discipline became control. The same man who promised freedom through work had created a system that watched, measured, and molded its people. It was a benevolence wrapped in surveillance, a fairness paid for by submission. The factories themselves were cathedrals of contradiction. Within their walls, humanity and machinery merged into something neither fully alive nor entirely mechanical. The roar of engines drowned out voices. The clatter of parts became the heartbeat of a new age. Men moved in unison, stripped of individuality, each performing a task so narrow that the whole became invisible to them. They no longer built cars. They built fragments of cars, fragments of dreams. Ford's genius was to turn complexity into order, but in doing so he divided the human spirit into increments of motion. Progress became the art of precision, and precision came at the cost of the soul. Outside the factory gates, the image of Ford glowed brighter than ever. Newspapers praised his generosity, politicians invoked his name, and the world marveled at his power. He was the man who had made America move, who had brought mobility to the masses. Yet behind that image, another reality unfolded. The pace of production was punishing, injuries were frequent, and exhaustion was constant. The promise of prosperity demanded the sacrifice of health, family, and time. The worker, exalted in theory, remained trapped in practice, chained not by poverty alone, but by the rhythm of progress itself. As Ford's empire expanded, so too did his belief in order and control. He envisioned not merely a company, but a civilization shaped by his ideals. He detested waste, idleness, and dissent. When workers organized to demand better conditions, he saw it as betrayal, as an attack on the harmony he believed he had created. The strikes that followed were not mere economic disputes but mortal confrontations. The collision between a man's vision of perfection and the imperfect needs of human beings. The moral contradiction stood naked, a utopia built on obedience, a dream of equality sustained by hierarchy. In 1932, the Ford Hunger March brought the conflict into brutal clarity. Thousands of unemployed workers marched toward the River Rouge plant, driven by desperation, seeking not revolution but survival. They were met not with compassion but with bullets. The air filled with gunfire, screams, and smoke, the sound of progress defending itself. Men died on the cold ground outside the factory that had promised them a better life. In that moment, the great machine of progress revealed its human cost in blood. The dream of the working man's paradise cracked, exposing the hard steel beneath, yet the contradiction did not end there. Ford remained convinced that his mission was righteous. He believed that he was saving mankind from chaos, that his methods, though harsh, were necessary for order and prosperity. He saw his workers as partners in creation, even as he dictated the terms of their existence. The moral lines blurred, as they always do when ideals meet reality. The very system that promised dignity had become a cage, gilded by wages and darkened by control. The factory became a metaphor for the modern world, efficient, powerful, and profoundly lonely. The contradiction extended beyond labor into philosophy. Ford's distrust of bankers, his battles with financiers, his suspicion of elites, were born of a belief that honest work was the purest form of morality. But as his empire grew, he himself became an institution of power, an elite among elites. The man who championed simplicity lived in opulence. The man who preached independence relied on armies of laborers. His mansion, with its polished halls and glowing chandeliers, stood as the physical embodiment of this tension, beauty carved from the sweat of others. Every luxury within its walls was paid for in hours of repetition on the factory line. There was also a deeper contradiction in Ford's relationship with technology itself. He believed machines could ennoble humanity, yet his machines stripped men of their humanity. The same assembly line that promised efficiency also demanded conformity. The worker's individuality, creativity, and spontaneity, those distinctly human gifts, were sacrificed for speed and uniformity. Progress, in Ford's world, was not a partnership between man and machine, but a surrender of one to the other. And once surrendered, the balance was never restored. The moral weight of Ford's progress reached even further, into the society that idolized him. America embraced his methods, exported his principles, and built entire economies on his model. Cities grew around factories. Time itself began to move to the rhythm of production, and people came to measure their worth by their efficiency. The nation became an assembly line of its own, producing wealth at a pace that demanded ever greater human cost. Ford's ideals became America's reality, and in that transformation, the contradiction became a way of life. Ford never saw himself as a villain. To the end, he believed in the righteousness of his cause. He thought he had given the world a gift: mobility, independence, opportunity. And perhaps he had. But every gift bears a hidden price, and the price of Ford's progress was paid not in dollars, but in lives quietly diminished by labor. The world he built was faster, louder, more connected than ever before, but also more mechanical, more anxious, more detached. The moral contradiction remained unresolved, etched into the foundation of the very empire that had promised salvation through motion. Beneath the shimmering marble and manicured gardens of Henry Ford's mansion lay an invisible foundation built not of stone, but of human endurance. Behind the grandeur and the promise of the American dream, there existed an untold story of ordinary men and women who bore the true weight of Ford's vision. They were the ones whose hands assembled the empire, whose exhaustion filled the silence between the gears, whose lives turned quietly beneath the shadow of wealth that would never be theirs. For them, the mansion was not a home but a symbol, a distant light that marked how far they stood from the comfort their labor created. Every chandelier inside gleamed with the reflection of their sacrifices. Every corridor echoed faintly with the footsteps of those who could never enter. In the early years, when the dream was still being forged, the workers came from farms, small towns, and foreign lands. They arrived with hope, drawn by the promise of steady pay, of progress, of belonging to something larger than themselves. The Ford plant was their cathedral and the machine their altar. But the rhythm of the assembly line was merciless. It stripped away the individuality of every man who stood beside it, reducing human motion to repetition. Hours blurred into days, and days into years, each moment consumed by the unending demand for production. The speed of the line left no space for breath, no room for thought. A man's worth was measured by his endurance, not his imagination. For many, the dream of prosperity was a narrow one. Wages might have doubled, but so had the cost of life. Inflation ate away at every raise, and the relentless pace of the work left little time to enjoy the meager comfort it bought. The strain seeped into families, into marriages, into the fragile fabric of everyday existence. Husbands returned home too tired to speak. Mothers counted every penny for bread, and children learned early that their father's labor belonged to the company more than it did to them. The mansion, glowing across the river, seemed to mock their exhaustion. A monument to progress, built upon the quiet erosion of human lives. In winter, the men's breath froze in the air as they walked to the factory before dawn. The sound of whistles split the darkness, summoning them like clockwork to the endless repetition of their tasks. Inside, the heat and noise swallowed them whole. Metal shrieked, oil burned, and the vibration of machines burrowed into their bones. Accidents were common. A hand crushed here, a finger severed there, and the work went on. There was no pause for pain, no mourning for the injured. The assembly line did not grieve, it simply advanced. The worker became replaceable, his humanity secondary to his utility. And yet, they endured because the alternative was hunger. For women, the burden was doubled. While their husbands labored in the factories, they managed households on thin budgets, stretching every dollar to feed families that grew faster than wages. Many took in sewing or washing, or worked long hours in smaller factories to supplement their husband's pay. Their labor, though invisible, sustained the illusion of stability that Ford's empire depended upon. The company measured output in cars, but the true economy of survival was measured in the quiet heroism of those who made life passable in the margins. Children, too, carried the weight. They were expected to study, to behave, to become the next generation of workers. They learned early that the future was a factory waiting to consume them. When the economy faltered, it was the workers who fell first. Layoffs came swiftly and without mercy. Families that had scraped by on modest stability found themselves plunged into desperation. Savings evaporated, debts mounted, and the dream of progress turned hollow. Many walked miles in search of work, carrying the same calloused hands that had once built Ford's fortune. Breadlines stretched across city blocks, while the mansion's gardens remained immaculate. Its windows glowed at night like beacons of a different world, a world that continued to feast while the city starved. The contrast was unbearable, yet no one dared to speak it aloud. To question the empire was to risk everything. Some of the workers had once believed in Ford as a kind of savior, a man who understood their plight, who had risen from the same soil they had. They admired his independence, his defiance of bankers, his promise that honest labor could make any man free. But as years passed, that faith eroded. The company grew larger, the rules stricter, the surveillance tighter. Ford's agents visited workers' homes, inspecting for cleanliness, sobriety, moral conduct. Wages came with conditions, and loyalty was demanded like tribute. What had begun as trust turned to quiet resentment. Beneath the surface of obedience, A slow-burning anger took hold, the anger of men who realized they had given everything and received so little in return. There were moments when that anger broke through. Strikes erupted, protests gathered at the gates, and the police were called to restore order. The workers who stood in defiance were labeled agitators, enemies of progress, threats to stability. Some were beaten, others arrested. Ford, once the hero of the working class, became their warden. His obsession with control reached every corner of his empire. The mansion that had once symbolized triumph now seemed like a fortress built to keep the people out, to insulate power from the pain that sustained it. Each protest that echoed beyond its gates was another reminder that prosperity had not been shared, that the burden of progress had been borne by those least able to carry it. For the workers, time became a cycle of hope and disappointment. The war years brought employment again, but also fear. Factories shifted from cars to weapons, from tools of trowel to tools of death. The sons of factory men were drafted, sent overseas to fight in wars that made the rich richer and the poor expendable. Inside the plants, production surged, but the exhaustion deepened. Women filled the empty spaces on the line, proving their strength and resilience, even as they too became part of the great machinery that consumed human effort without pause. When the soldiers returned, the cycle began anew. More promises, more work, more silent sacrifices. The burden was not only physical, but emotional. Many of the workers carried with them a quiet humiliation, the knowledge that their labor built a world they could never fully enter. They built cars they could not afford, engines that carried strangers to places they would never see. They kept the empire alive, yet their own lives were lived in its shadow. Pride mixed with pain in equal measure. They believed in their craft, in their strength, in their endurance, but they also knew that each day spent under the roar of machines stole something from them. A little time, a little spirit, a little humanity. The Ford mansion, for all its beauty, was a mirror of these contradictions. It was built on a promise of progress, yet its foundation was sustained by invisible suffering. The chandeliers, the carved banisters, the quiet hum of wealth, all were made possible by the hands of men who lived in cramped apartments, who wore threadbare coats through Michigan winters, who prayed for stability as the markets rose and fell. The burden of Ford's empire was not borne by its creator alone, but by the multitude of lives tethered to his dream. They carried it without recognition, without reward, their stories fading into the background noise of history. The cycle of war, profit, and loss that sustained Ford's legacy was not merely a chapter in history, but a repeating rhythm that shaped his empire's very heartbeat. It began with the same contradiction that defined the age, the promise of peace built upon the machinery of conflict. The factories that produced the automobiles of freedom were the same that, in times of crisis, could be turned to the production of engines for war. Progress and destruction shared the same assembly lines. The hum of industry was constant, whether it built vehicles for families or weapons for soldiers. Ford's empire thrived on this rhythm, rising and falling with the tides of global conflict, each surge of demand feeding the illusion of unbroken prosperity while concealing the cost beneath layers of debt, exhaustion, and grief. In the years after the First World War, the world looked to rebuild, and Ford stood at the center of it. His cars symbolized recovery, independence, and a new kind of mobility. Nations torn apart by conflict longed for the simplicity of movement, the feeling that progress could erase the scars of battle. But beneath the optimism of the 1920s, economies trembled. The war had left nations drowning in debt, their currencies weakened, their people restless. To fuel his empire's expansion, Ford relied on the same fragile global network that had been fractured by war, a network of trade, loans, and supply lines that could collapse at any tremor. Every car shipped abroad carried not just American innovation, but also the weight of international uncertainty. The prosperity of the decade was an illusion built upon unstable foundation. As European markets faltered and inflation tightened its grip, Ford's empire leaned more heavily on domestic production. The United States became both customer and creditor, feeding its industries with the promise of endless demand. But when that demand slowed, the machinery of Ford's empire began to strain. Production outpaced consumption, warehouses filled, and the profits that once seemed eternal began to thin. The same factories that had once armed the Allied effort now stood too quiet, their silence echoing the absence of war's demand. For the first time, the idea that peace might be bad for business began to haunt the corridors of industry. When the Great Depression arrived, the cycle turned cruelly against Ford and the millions who depended on him. Markets collapsed, banks failed, and money itself seemed to vanish from the air. The empire that had symbolized abundance became an emblem of uncertainty. Factories slowed, then stopped. Thousands were laid off, their livelihoods evaporating overnight. The very system that had flourished in times of need now withered in the calm of peace. The country that had once marched forward to the rhythm of production now stood still, paralyzed by its own excess. Ford, once the prophet of efficiency, found himself powerless against the invisible weight of economic despair. But history, as it always does, turned again toward conflict. As the 1930s darkened, with the threat of another global war, the engines of industry stirred once more. Demand returned, not for cars, but for the tools of war. The same steel, rubber, and oil that built mobility now built destruction. Ford's factories, vast and efficient, became part of the machinery that armed the world. The River Rouge plant, once a symbol of peace and progress, began to echo with a different kind of urgency. The workers who had struggled through the Depression found employment again, their wages restored, their hands busy. Yet beneath the relief lay a grim truth. Prosperity had returned, but only because war had returned with it. The war economy was both salvation and curse. It brought jobs, contracts, and wealth, but it also bound Ford's empire to the same system of global violence he had once claimed to despise. Ford himself, deeply opposed to war in principle, found his ideals crushed under the weight of necessity. His company, like so many others, could not refuse the demands of the state or the profit that followed them. Every bomb, every engine, every armored vehicle carried a trace of his empire's craftsmanship. The same precision that once built cars for families now built machines that tore families apart. The contradiction was unbearable, yet it persisted, as all contradictions do when profit is at stake. On the home front, the cycle of war and work consumed ordinary lives. The workers who had once faced layoffs now labored night and day, producing materials for battlefields they would never see. Their wages rose, but so did their fatigue. The demands of production grew unrelenting, the pressure of patriotism leaving no room for hesitation. Women entered the factories in unprecedented numbers, filling the gaps left by men who went to fight. They worked with skill and pride, yet their efforts, too, were bound to the same cycle of creation and destruction. The war gave them purpose and independence, but it also tied their futures to an economy that could not survive without conflict. Abroad, the products of Ford's factories became part of the machinery that reshaped the world. The trucks and engines that rolled from Detroit's assembly lines carried soldiers, supplies, and death across continents. Each vehicle bore the mark of American ingenuity, a testament to the power of mass production. Yet for every engine that roared to life, there was a silence left behind. The silence of fields turned to graves, of towns reduced to ash. Profit and loss became indistinguishable, measured not in dollars but in lives. The war made Ford's empire stronger than ever, but at the cost of the very humanity it had once claimed to serve. When the war ended, the factories fell quiet again, and the old questions returned. What was progress without conflict to feed it? What was prosperity when peace demanded less production, fewer workers, smaller profits? The same problem that haunted the 1920s returned with new weight. Ford's empire, vast and efficient, was built for motion, for growth, for demand without end. Yet peace brought stillness, and stillness brought decline. The machinery that had roared for years could not simply rest. It needed to be fed with new products, new ambitions, new markets. The war had created momentum that peace could not sustain. For the workers, the cycle was exhausting. Each generation seemed to live through the same rhythm: prosperity in wartime, poverty in peace. They had watched the factory gates open with the sound of sirens and close again with silence. The promise of stability always proved temporary. Ford's empire offered them continuity but never security. Their lives were measured in contracts, their futures tied to the unpredictable needs of distant powers. They worked to build engines for war, and dreamed of peace they could not afford. The mansion itself, standing silent through these storms, reflected this cycle in its own way. It had been built during a time of ambition, survived through times of despair, and thrived again during the fever of war. Its walls had witnessed the full measure of the 20th century's turmoil, the rise of industry, the fall of economies, the madness of conflict, and through it all, it remained untouched, serene, indifferent. The profits of war sustained its elegance. The losses of peace never dimmed its light. It stood as the perfect symbol of Ford's legacy, magnificent, enduring, and built upon a rhythm of struggle that never truly ceased. The mansion stood as more than a home. It was the embodiment of ambition's shell, a physical monument to both the brilliance and the blindness of progress. Its towering walls rose from the Michigan soil like a declaration of triumph, yet beneath the stone and glass there lingered a silence that felt almost mournful. Every column, every polished stair, every glint of the chandeliers seemed to carry the echo of a question history has never fully answered. What is the true cost of greatness when it is built on unseen sacrifice? The Ford mansion was the jewel of an age obsessed with invention, with the idea that man could master both nature and destiny. But behind the perfection of its architecture lay the imperfections of its maker's world, the contradictions, the depths, the exhaustion of a nation chasing a dream too heavy to hold. In daylight, it shimmered with the confidence of industry's golden age. The grounds stretched in symmetry, the gardens sculpted to reflect control and order. Visitors were struck by its scale, its precision, the sheer assertion of wealth turned tangible. Yet the very symmetry that impressed them was also a symbol of dominance, the idea that the world could be arranged, managed, engineered into obedience. The mansion was not only a home, but a philosophy in stone, an extension of the same logic that drove Ford's factories. Just as his workers stood in perfect sequence along the assembly line, so too did every arch, every tree, every window align in mechanical perfection. But unlike the workers, the mansion did not tire, did not age, did not dream of escape. At night, when the lights burned across its many rooms, the mansion glowed like an island of permanence in a world unraveling. Outside its gates, the Great Depression had stripped families of homes, jobs, and dignity. Breadlines wound through frozen streets. Men sold their last possession for food, and women pawned wedding rings to keep their children warm. Inside the mansion, silence reigned. The warmth of its hearths, the gleam of its floors, stood in painful contrast to the cold realities beyond. That contrast was the mansion's most haunting truth. It was not merely built upon the labor of the poor, it existed as a mirror of their absence. It was everything they were told to strive for, and nothing they could ever reach. The workers who toiled in Ford's factories rarely saw the world that their labor sustained. They knew its outline through rumor, through the stories of its ballroom, its gardens, its endless halls. Some admired it, others resented it. But all understood that their hands had made it possible. Their sweat had turned into wages, their wages into profits, and those profits into stone. For them, the mansion was both proof and betrayal, the visible form of a promise that had quietly shifted away from them. It stood as a reminder that progress had always been selective, that, even in an age of mass production, privilege remained handcrafted. The mansion's beauty was undeniable, but beauty often conceals more than it reveals. Its silence was not peace, but suppression, a quiet that buried the noise of the world that fed it. The tick of its clocks marked not hours, but generations of effort compressed into comfort. The echo of footsteps across its marble floors carried faintly the rhythm of the assembly line. To walk its corridors was to feel the tension between the mechanical and the human, between the precision of progress and the imperfection of the people who made it possible. It was a house that demanded admiration, yet whispered unease to those who listened closely. For Ford himself, the mansion was a retreat, a space where he could escape the chaos of the world he had built. Yet even here the contradictions followed him. The wealth that insulated him also isolated him. He had dreamed of unity, of a world where men and machines worked in harmony, but found himself surrounded instead by quiet luxury and distance. The mansion's grandeur did not comfort him. It reminded him of the gulf between his ideals and his reality. He could not live among the people whose lives his empire defined, and he could not live without them. The walls that protected him from the world also kept him from belonging to it. The mansion's opulence masked an empire constantly under strain. Behind the glittering facade lay a ledger of anxiety, the debts, the inflation, the endless need to produce more, to sell more, to stay ahead of collapse. Every room in the house represented a transaction, every painting a decision measured in risk. The financial pressures that haunted Ford's empire echoed here, invisible but omnipresent. Wealth had not erased the fear of loss, it had amplified it. The higher the mansion rose, the deeper its foundations sank into uncertainty. Its beauty was not born of serenity but of defiance, an attempt to build permanence in a world that refused to stay still. The mansion also reflected a larger truth about the age it belonged to. It was not just Ford's home, it was America's mirror. The nation itself was learning to balance prosperity and inequality, invention and exploitation, pride and guilt. The Ford Mansion became a symbol of that tension, a place where progress was celebrated and its consequences politely ignored. It embodied the American myth that one man's genius could elevate an entire people even as. It revealed how few truly rose with him. The house did not simply contain history, it became it. Visitors who entered its halls could not help but be awed by its craftsmanship. Yet some, even in admiration, felt a strange unease, as if the air itself carried memory. The polished wood, the intricate ceilings, the long corridors, all seemed to hum with the residue of what had been traded to create them. It was as if the mansion remembered the cost that the world had chosen to forget. The workers who labored unseen, the families who bore the burden of economic collapse, the soldiers who fought wars that kept industry alive, their presence lingered in absence. The mansion's silence was not emptiness but remembrance. The gardens, perfectly trimmed and endlessly green, offered another illusion. They were symbols of order in a century defined by disorder. Nature itself had been tamed, arranged, disciplined into beauty, just as workers had been disciplined into efficiency. But beyond the gates, the earth told a different story of floods, of hunger, of a planet bending under the weight of human ambition. The contrast between the manicured perfection of the grounds and the struggling soil beyond was the story of Ford's empire in miniature. The mansion did not just represent wealth, it represented control, the belief that man could command everything, even the consequences of his own creation. As the years passed, and the mansion aged, its meaning deepened. Dust settled on its mantels, but the aura of its past remained untouched. Visitors came and went, historians took notes, but the building itself seemed alive, holding its secrets close. To look upon it was to see not only the story of one man, but of an era, an age, that mistook motion for progress, invention for salvation, power for permanence. The mansion had outlived its builder, its workers, its time, yet it carried them all within its silence. It was the last witness of a dream that had reshaped the world and the burden that dream left behind.